In Red Valley, Mississippi, in the stifling summer of 1902, silence was not peace. It was merely the absence of proof. Mary Lou Carter was a master of that quiet. She moved like a shadow cast by moonlight, her small, worn leather shoes barely whispering against the newly polished pine floors of Sheriff Harlan Boyd's great house. It was this invisibility that allowed her to live, and now, it was this same spectral quality that would allow her to kill. Valued at the time for her compliance and her small frame, less mouth to feed, less resistance to break, Mary Lou existed strictly as a functionary. She was the hand that scrubbed the blood from the sheriff's starched collars, the ear that heard the careless late-night boasts, and the eye that read the crumpled notes discarded in the mahogany wastebaskets. They did not see her. They saw a space filler, a vessel for lye and lavender, a girl with skin the color of strong coffee who had learned 32 years of servitude in her 22 years of life. Her memory was the true anomaly. It was not merely keen, it was photographic, a precise archive of every misplaced ledger entry, every hastily written appointment, every flicker of guilt across a man's face. She catalogued these details with the quiet dedication of a scholar studying a poisonous language. In a world where black lives were measured in utility and chattel, Mary Lou had found a currency they couldn't confiscate: information. The sheriff's house was a fortress built on hypocrisy. Out front, the white columns declared order and righteousness. Inside, the heavy velvet drapes muffled secrets. Mary Lou spent the early hours of that July morning moving through the sheriff's study. The air was thick with humidity and the stale scent of cigar smoke and expensive whiskey. She was ostensibly dusting the leather-bound law books, statutes that Boyd selectively enforced to maintain his suffocating grip on Red Valley. As her cloth brushed the desk, her eyes scanned. Sheriff Boyd was obsessed with appearances, but he was sloppy about the paperwork that truly mattered. He kept a small locked metal strongbox beneath the loose floorboard under the oriental rug, a fact Mary Lou noted when the maid before her, poor Sadie, had dropped a piece of silver and Boyd had cursed and kicked the rug back into place. Mary Lou knew the box held more than just money, it held leverage. Today, however, it was the small things on the desk that claimed her attention. A newly sharpened pencil, a half-written letter and a small square green ticket tucked beneath a heavy glass paperweight, shaped like a cotton bowl. The letter was addressed to Cyrus Finch, the cotton baron, a man whose wealth rivaled the entire county budget. It was incomplete, a formal request for an extension on some payment, referencing the recent misunderstanding regarding the river contracts. Mary Lou logged the details. Finch was being pressured by Boyd. The most powerful man in the county was running scared, and the lawman held the leash. The green ticket was for the governor's charity ball, an event months away, scheduled for late autumn at the Finch plantation. Boyd wasn't just planning to attend, he was planning to make a show. He was trying to climb, desperate to step out of the dirt-clotted local politics and into the higher echelons of state power. Mary Lou gently replaced the ticket, leaving no dust displacement, no fingerprint, no sign that an enemy had been examining the blueprints of his arrogance. She was not ready to strike yet. She was still in the collection phase, the quiet compilation of kindling. The fire had to consume everything, and a fire started too soon only brought the immediate brutal swing of the axe. She retreated to the kitchen, where the smells of lye, soap, and boiling water formed a protective wall. It was here, 2 weeks prior, that the world had ended for her. Johnny, 16 years old. He had been working odd jobs, mostly helping at the livery stable near the courthouse square. Johnny had a bright, quick smile and the nervous energy of a caged bird. He wasn't like Mary Lou. He couldn't hold the silence. He spoke. "They got something hidin', Lou," he had whispered to her over a plate of corn grits, his eyes wide and jittery. "Saw them dragging something heavy late at night, near the judge's property line. It wasn't stock, smelled like metal and something else, something rotten." The judge he spoke of was Judge Hawthorne, the third pillar of Red Valley's white supremacy, a man who spoke with florid legal poetry while ensuring the prisons were filled with cheap black labor. Johnny had seen a transaction, a theft, a brutal moment of institutional violence, too big and too ugly for a boy to hold inside. Mary Lou had told him, using the few words she reserved only for him. "Forget what you seen, Johnny. The devil knows how to use your eyes." But Johnny couldn't forget, and the devil, embodied by the men who owned Red Valley, had a long memory for those who looked too closely. He disappeared 2 weeks ago. No struggle, no witness, no body, just a gap in the world. Boyd had been informed by his deputy, Deputy Shaw, a man with weak eyes and a stronger moral compass than his boss, that Johnny had simply run off like they do. Sheriff Boyd, however, had responded to the news with a peculiar lack of interest. He had looked Mary Lou right in the face, the first time he had truly looked at her in years, and had given her a chillingly casual instruction. Clean out his quarters, girl. Don't need no empty space breeding bad notions. There were no tears. The tears had been burned away by the dry, searing heat of the Mississippi summer, and the knowledge that Boyd's indifference was confirmation. Johnny hadn't run. He had been erased. The trauma did not produce hysteria. It produced clarity. The grief calcified instantly into a hard, cold knot in her gut, a perfect sphere of murderous resolve. The law would not touch Boyd. God, if he existed, was clearly occupied elsewhere. Justice would not be served by pleading or by flight. It would be delivered by Mary Lou, one poisoned drop at a time, until the foundation of their perfect white town dissolved beneath them. Her plan, which formed rapidly and with the sharp logic of a mathematical equation, involved 3 targets: the unholy trinity of Red Valley, Sheriff Harlan Boyd, the brute force, Judge Arthur Hawthorne, the legal cover, and Cyrus Finch, the economic engine. They were interdependent. If she could pit them against each other, the resulting internal pressure would fracture the whole structure. The beauty of her position lay in her access. She worked for Boyd. She did laundry for Judge Hawthorne's wife, receiving piles of their dirty secrets weekly, both literally and figuratively, and she spent every Saturday cleaning the Finch family's extravagant carriage house and polishing the silver in their sprawling, lonely mansion. She was the connector, the invisible wire running between their insulated homes. The first step was to establish the weakness of the legal cover, Judge Hawthorne. Hawthorne was a pompous man, a connoisseur of fine whiskey and amateur poetry. He lived in the shadow of his ambitious younger wife, Clara. Clara was desperate for social standing, constantly battling for attention with the richer, more established Finch family. Mary Lou knew about Hawthorne's secret vice, gambling debts. And she knew about Clara's weakness, vanity and deep insecurity. That afternoon, Mary Lou carried the heavy basket of laundry from the Boyd house across the sweltering town center toward the Hawthorne residence. The heat pressed down like a physical weight, baking the dust into a fine red film that coated everything. As she walked, she rehearsed the sequence in her mind. When she arrived at the Hawthorne's back entrance, the judge's cook, a sturdy older woman named Ruth, greeted her with a weary nod. Ruth had been a good friend to Johnny, slipping him extra bread when he needed it. Her eyes held the same silent sorrow Mary Lou carried. "Heat's awful, Lou," Ruth muttered, taking a handkerchief from her apron. Mary Lou nodded slightly, keeping her face neutral. She went straight to the laundry room, a humid chamber of copper tubs and steaming clothes. Mrs. Hawthorne's intimate apparel was separated from the judge's stiff judicial robes. As Mary Lou sorted the robes, she noticed a small, distinct tear in the judge's right sleeve lining. A perfect chance. Boyd was a bully, but Hawthorne was a coward. He would never confront Boyd directly, but he might betray him if he believed Boyd was using him as a scapegoat. Mary Lou finished the washing, rinsing the linens until they snapped clean. Before leaving, she found Ruth alone, preparing dinner. She spoke 3 words, the clearest she had spoken since Johnny vanished, her voice barely a breath. "Boyd, debt, judge." Ruth stopped chopping vegetables, her knife hovering over the cutting board. Her eyes narrowed, the weariness replaced by a sudden, intense understanding. "What kind of debt, Chili?" Mary Lou shook her head, indicating she could not say more. Instead, she retrieved a tiny, almost invisible slip of paper she had carried from the sheriff's discarded waste, one she had committed to memory before burning. It was a cryptic note regarding a gambling marker, written in the judge's familiar, loopy hand, but addressed to a known associate of Boyd, not to Boyd himself. Mary Lou laid the paper on the counter, pointed quickly to the name of the associate, Silas, and then pointed towards the judge's robes. She was implying that Silas, who owed Boyd, was collecting for the sheriff, forcing Hawthorne to pay up or face public ruin. Ruth, a woman who understood the complex subterranean economy of favors and threats that kept the white ruling class afloat, processed the information instantly. "They squeeze him, them bastards." Mary Lou nodded. This was not a direct accusation, just a planted seed of confirmation. Ruth, loyal to the judge only so far as her own survival allowed, needed leverage. If the judge was about to be ruined by Boyd, Ruth needed to know, maybe even to protect herself. The information would travel through the servants' network, a powerful, invisible telegraph system that linked the kitchens of the powerful. "You take care, child," Ruth whispered, tucking the note away. Mary Lou gave her a single sharp look, a look that held the promise of vengeance, and turned to leave. The next piece of the puzzle lay at the Finch estate. Cyrus Finch's wealth was built on cotton and the sweat of hundreds of souls, but his reputation relied heavily on his fragile, socialite wife, Evangeline, and her passion for collecting priceless Chinese porcelain. The Finch house was not about fear, like Boyd's, or pretension, like Hawthorne's. It was about distance. Finch operated from an impersonal height of power, his cruelty measured in the price of a bail and the interest rate on a loan. Mary Lou arrived at the Finch estate on Saturday, working primarily in the vast shadowed carriage house and the adjacent storage rooms. These were places the Finch family rarely visited, allowing Mary Lou time to explore without the constant scrutiny she faced at Boyd's. Cyrus Finch had two weaknesses she could exploit: his pride and his wife's obsession. While dusting the massive cabinets containing rare maps and ledgers, Mary Lou focused on a set of small dark brown ledgers marked shipping and tariffs. She found what she was looking for immediately. Finch was involved in a massive, ongoing smuggling operation involving imported goods to avoid tariffs, including the porcelain his wife adored. This was a federal crime, far exceeding Boyd's small-town bullying jurisdiction. But the most critical detail was not the crime itself, it was the accomplice. Flipping through the ledgers, her memory meticulously recording every number, every date, she saw repeated transactions listed under the alias AB. AB had a distinct habit of signing off every entry with a small, self-important flourish. Mary Lou compared the flourish mentally with another signature she had seen hundreds of times on petty court documents at Boyd's house: Arthur Hawthorne. Judge Hawthorne was not just Boyd's victim, he was Finch's smuggling partner. The realization brought a cold wave of satisfaction. Boyd was squeezing Hawthorne on gambling debts. Hawthorne was secretly partnering with Finch to cheat the government. Finch was being pressured by Boyd over river contracts. They were a tangle of snakes eating each other's tails. Mary Lou only needed to introduce the poison that would make them choke. She spent the remainder of the afternoon cataloging Finch's vulnerabilities. She found a private letter from an associate in New York, confirming Finch had suffered catastrophic losses in the recent cotton market collapse, far greater than he publicly admitted. His empire was held together by paper and pride. Mary Lou knew that if Boyd ever discovered Hawthorne was cheating Finch, the judge would be instantly eliminated. And if Finch discovered Boyd was using federal land disputes to pressure him, Finch would unleash his considerable financial power against the sheriff. Her strategy sharpened. She must leverage Boyd's greed against Finch's desperation, using Hawthorne's duplicity as the fuse. That evening, back at the cabin she and Johnny had shared, now unbearably quiet, Mary Lou sat by the hearth. She did not light a fire, but used a spent matchstick to trace the map of Red Valley in the dirt floor, marking the three houses. She had the necessary secrets. Now she needed the delivery system. The information had to arrive precisely where it would cause maximum damage, but appear to have come from a source they would immediately suspect: each other. She remembered a book she had been forced to dust in Boyd's study, a thick medical text on psychological afflictions of the modern gentleman. Boyd himself had been complaining of headaches and restless nights recently, a testament to the weight of his own criminality. The book mentioned certain antiquated remedies for nervous humors, often involving herbs and poultices, the old knowledge of the land, the kind Boyd dismissed as colored folk superstition. But Mary Lou knew those superstitions held power. She knew a woman, Granny Elvira, who lived far out in the swamps, who dealt in roots and silent medicines. If Boyd's anxiety could be exacerbated, if his paranoia could be amplified, and if the evidence of Hawthorne's betrayal could land on his desk at the precise moment he was convinced he was losing his mind, the collapse would be total. Mary Lou rose, her silence now heavy with intent. She looked at Johnny's empty cot. Her hands were steady. The time for waiting was over. The time for subtle contamination had begun. The next morning, Sunday, Mary Lou was back in the sheriff's kitchen preparing his breakfast. She prepared his eggs, bacon, and coffee. She knew Boyd drank his coffee without cream or sugar, insisting on the bitterness. She slipped away briefly to the small, wild patch behind the washhouse, where thickets of local weeds grew, and returned with a few crushed leaves of a specific plant. Granny Elvira called it the sleepwalker's breath. It was not a fast poison, but a slow, subtle irritant. It caused jitters, amplified sounds, and induced relentless, low-grade insomnia. Returning to the kitchen, she carefully measured the almost tasteless powder, stirring it into the grounds before the water was added, ensuring it dissolved completely into the dark bitterness Boyd so cherished. She carried the tray upstairs, her steps silent as ever. Boyd was already dressed, sitting heavily at his mahogany table, rubbing his temples. "You're slow this morning, girl," he grumbled, not looking at her. She placed the coffee cup precisely on the coaster. Her eyes caught a small sealed envelope tucked into the sheriff's breast pocket, a letter from the governor's office, stamped with the state seal. Boyd was clearly excited, preparing for his climb. Mary Lou watched as he lifted the cup to his lips, his hand already trembling slightly from the previous restless night. He took a long, deep sip. He winced momentarily at the taste, but only because she had made it stronger than usual. "Good, strong," he said, slamming the cup back down. Mary Lou felt a cold, deep satisfaction. The poison was delivered. Now for the fuse. She had one item she had taken from the Finch ledgers, a blank shipping manifest, but one printed on Finch's unique, expensive vellum paper. That afternoon, using the privacy of her empty cabin, Mary Lou meticulously copied a piece of information she had committed to memory from Boyd's study. The exact figures and dates of the Finch-Hawthorne smuggling operation, writing them neatly onto the Finch paper, mimicking Hawthorne's loopy handwriting with perfect accuracy. The risk was immense. If Boyd caught her forging documents, the resulting violence would be swift and conclusive. But Boyd wasn't looking for forgery from her. He was looking for betrayal from his own kind. The next day, she carried the forged document, folded tightly, hidden deep in the hem of her skirt. Her target was the judge's house, where she was scheduled to return the clean laundry. She found the judge's library unlocked. Judge Hawthorne was notorious for leaving his study door ajar, inviting his social circle to admire his intellect, even if he wasn't there to witness the admiration. Mary Lou entered silently, the smell of dust and old leather filling her nostrils. She moved to the large globe in the corner, a gift Hawthorne used to illustrate his worldliness. She slipped the document not into a desk drawer, but into a specific volume on the shelf. Federal Statutes, 1898-1902. She wanted the judge to find it when he was looking for reassurance, for legality, for cover. Then the final crucial step, ensuring Boyd found out about the document before Hawthorne knew it was there. Mary Lou moved back towards the kitchen, where Ruth was preparing a large ham. She approached the back door, pausing dramatically, letting the screen door rattle slightly. Ruth looked up, annoyed. "Lou, you're standing in the draft." Mary Lou's eyes were fixed on the kitchen table, where Mrs. Hawthorne's society newspaper lay open. She pointed to a small circled advertisement for a rare book sale at the local general store. She then pointed at the judge's library. And then she spoke, loud enough for Ruth to hear, but low enough to sound frightened. "A book. He shouldn't have. Be looking for it now." Ruth put down her knife. The judge was a fanatic about his library. If he was looking for a specific, compromised book, it meant something was severely wrong. Mary Lou then returned to the Boyd house, the adrenaline singing in her veins. She had sown the seed of suspicion at the judge's house. Now she needed to ensure Boyd learned of the book that night, convincing him the judge was moving his own secrets. Boyd returned late that evening, visibly agitated. The insomnia was already setting in, and the world seemed louder to him. Mary Lou was serving him a glass of iced tea when Deputy Shaw entered, breathless. "Sheriff, sir, we got a problem down at the general store. Judge Hawthorne's been making a scene, claiming the general store owner sold a valuable manuscript he owned." Boyd rubbed his eyes, the sleepwalker's breath sharpening his irritability. "A manuscript? He's lost his damn mind. Which one?" "Some old federal statutes book, sir. Said he heard it was being moved." Mary Lou, standing against the wall, watched Boyd's face twist. The judge, panicking and looking for his secrets, confirming Mary Lou's planted rumor. Boyd didn't know the judge was looking for his own secrets, but he instantly assumed the judge was trying to hide Boyd's secrets. "Heard it was being moved?" Boyd's voice was dangerously low. "Who told him that?" The deputy shrugged. "Just talk, Sheriff. Said he heard a rumor from the staff." Boyd looked towards Mary Lou, suspicion flickering. She held her gaze perfectly steady, a statue of compliant servitude. "Get out, Shaw," Boyd snapped. He stood up, pacing the room, his hand instinctively going to the letter from the governor in his breast pocket. He was being undercut. The judge was moving files. This was treason. Mary Lou watched the poison work, the insomnia, the paranoia, the sudden confirmation that the judge was acting against him. The fragile alliance was cracking. She knew what Boyd would do next. He would not confront Hawthorne directly. He would go looking for what the judge was trying to hide. Later that night, long after the house had quieted, Mary Lou crept into the hallway. She heard the familiar rhythmic snoring of Boyd from his bedroom. She knew the sedative was working, slowing his heavy movements. She moved quickly to the study, navigating the room purely by muscle memory. She knelt by the oriental rug, lifted the edge, and located the loose floorboard. The strongbox was there, cold and heavy. She placed her ear against it. Mary Lou reached into her own pocket and pulled out a delicate, thin wire she had painstakingly sharpened. She had observed Boyd opening and closing the box countless times, noting the slight shift of his thumb on the lock. It wasn't a complicated mechanism, just one that required perfect, patient attention. She inserted the wire. Time stood still. One wrong movement and the click would echo through the silent house. She needed to retrieve the evidence of Boyd's pressure on Finch and plant the evidence of Hawthorne's smuggling partnership. She pushed the wire, feeling the faint friction, waiting for the resistance to vanish. The only sound was the frantic thump of her own heart against her ribs. After 3 agonizing minutes, she felt it. A soft, almost inaudible snick. Mary Lou opened the strongbox, revealing a stack of documents bound in red tape and a small, heavy bag of gold coins. Her eyes fixed on a specific packet labeled Finch River Dispute. She lifted the packet, her heart rate accelerating, knowing she held the first piece of undeniable leverage. The silence of the house pressed in around her. The air tasted of dust and inevitable consequence. She quickly replaced the Finch document with the forged manifest detailing Hawthorne's involvement in Finch's smuggling operation. A swap that would appear as if Boyd had stolen the manifest from Finch or Hawthorne and was using it to pressure them both. She was fixing to close the box when she heard the floorboard above her squeak. The snoring had stopped. Mary Lou froze, the Finch papers clutched in her hand. The silence was absolute now, the heavy, dangerous kind that preceded violence. She knew that sound. It wasn't the sound of Boyd rolling over. It was the sound of weight being settled onto the soles of bare feet. He was awake. He was listening. The sweat broke cold on Mary Lou's spine, stinging the old scars that mapped her back. It was not the heat of the cramped space that chilled her, but the profound, unnerving silence above. Boyd Finch wasn't just awake. He was still. A still master was a deadly master. When they moved, you knew what they wanted. When they were still, they were fishing, waiting for the ripple that betrayed the hidden thing beneath the surface. She heard the slight shift of weight, a subtle compression of the floor joist directly overhead. He was standing maybe 5 feet from the hearth where the missing floorboard lay. He hadn't seen the gap. He was listening for breath, for the rustle of linen, for anything that didn't belong to the silent, slumbering house. Mary Lou clamped her jaw shut, willing the air in her lungs to still. Her hand clutching the bundle of folded papers, the Finch papers, the ledger, the notes, was jammed against a cold, damp stone foundation. She could feel the vibration of the house through the rock. The subtle tremor that meant something heavy was still suspended above her. A slow, deliberate tap sounded on the planking, right near the edge of the fireplace hearth. Not a loud tap, just enough to test the acoustic properties of the room, to see if anything responded, even a gasp. She remembered the fear, deep and paralyzing, that had owned her when she was younger. The terror that made the hands shake, the mind go blank, the knees give out. That fear was gone now, replaced by a cold, calculating adrenaline. It was the same feeling she got when running a complicated stitch pattern, a focused, singular determination. That error was not an option. The silence returned, thick and choking. Boyd wasn't moving. He was either drunk enough to be confused or sober enough to be extremely dangerous. If he lifts that board, I have less than a breath, she thought. He is too big for me to fight, too fast for me to run. She shifted her gaze, tracking the path she needed to take. She had to move sideways, parallel to the main beam, about 4 feet until she reached the relative safety beneath the kitchen pantry, a darker, less disturbed part of the crawl space. She counted the seconds. 118 ticks passed. She could smell the cheap whiskey on his breath, filtered through the gaps in the floor, a sour, heavy aroma that was an integral part of the house's sickness. Then she heard it. A low, grumbling sigh followed by the heavy, complaining squeak of the master bed springs. He had decided it was nothing. The house was settling, the wind was catching the shingles, or his own bloated imagination was playing tricks. He was giving up. This was her opening. Not when the bed springs sang, but in the moment, after they fell silent, when his massive frame settled back into the mattress, anticipating sleep. In that half-second gap, Mary Lou exhaled the stagnant air and began to move. She did not crawl, she flowed, flattening her body against the damp earth, propelling herself with the tips of her fingers and toes, a snake moving through sand. There was no noise from her. The damp wool of her clothes absorbed the minuscule sounds of movement. She reached the pantry void, pulling herself into the deep shadow. Another 60 seconds passed, verifying he was truly asleep. The thick, resonant snore returned, a sound like a great damaged bellows. Only then did she begin the careful process of re-entering the world above. She crept back, moving with practiced slowness, until she was directly beneath the missing board. She reached up, testing the edges of the gap. She moved the heavy ledger and papers into the pocket she'd stitched into her apron, a deep, reinforced canvas pocket that could hold the weight. Then she pressed upwards, using every ounce of controlled strength, forcing the board back into place. It settled with a whisper, fitting perfectly into the knot she had filed down months ago. It was sealed. She was out. Mary Lou stood in the center of the kitchen, the moonlight filtering grayly through the single small window. The air was cold now, despite the lingering heat of the day. Her heart beat a rapid, furious rhythm against her ribs. The physical danger was past, but the work, the real, treacherous work, had just begun. She moved silently through the back door and out into the yard. The quarters were silent, dark shapes huddled together against the cold night air. She did not go back to her own cabin. She headed instead toward the edge of the property, where the old smokehouse stood half-collapsed, unused since the hogs stopped thriving 5 years ago. Inside, sitting on an overturned bucket, waiting patiently, was Eli. Eli was technically a field hand, but he was one of those singular men that seemed to contain a universe inside him. He was a cooper by trade, his hands thick and calloused from shaping wood, but his mind was sharp and quick, a hidden knife in the dark. He had learned to read by watching the overseer mark the supply lists, teaching himself the shapes of the letters over years of patient observation. He was Mary Lou's only confidant, and her necessary connection to understanding the master's financial ruin. "Well?" Eli's voice was low, rough, barely audible above the chirping of the night crickets. Mary Lou did not answer immediately. She sat beside him and pulled out the thick bundle of papers. The weight of them felt enormous, the potential of them staggering. "He woke up," she whispered. Eli simply nodded, his silhouette framed against the smokehouse doorway. "I heard him move about 10 minutes after you went under. I figured you were either caught or had to play possum. I played possum. He's back to sleep." She handed him the ledger first. "This is the one, the full accounting. The others are notes, receipts, and his correspondence with that Charleston man, Callahan." Eli took the papers, his calloused fingers turning the fine paper with surprising delicacy. He had risked the lash, or worse, 100 times merely by learning to recognize the script. Reading these papers could mean death by burning, but they both understood the necessity. Boyd Finch was not just a cruel master, he was a desperate one, and desperation was a fire that could consume everyone nearby. Eli struck a flint, igniting a tiny, carefully shielded piece of rushlight they had hidden in a dry tin. He squinted at the ledger pages. The language of finance was a foreign country, but Eli was fluent in the language of debt. He scanned the columns, his lips moving silently, tracing the numbers. Mary Lou watched his face, her own reflection of tension fixed upon his expression. After what felt like an hour, Eli blew out the rushlight, plunging them back into absolute darkness. "It's worse than we thought, Mary Lou," he said, his voice grave. "How much worse?" "The land is mortgaged to the hilt with the People's Bank of Charleston. The note is due in 6 weeks. 6 weeks, Mary Lou, not 6 months. Mary Lou felt a strange calm settle over her. She had planned for 3 months. 6 weeks was a lightning strike, but it was still a window. And the Callahan man, the receipts. Callahan is the short game. Boyd owes him nearly $15,000 for supplies, seed, and manufactured goods. Callahan has filed a preliminary writ against the property. He's threatening to seize the crop, what little there is, and demanding immediate sale of 40 heads of prime stock to cover the debt. Boyd told him he only had 10 to spare. Mary Lou slowly ran her tongue over her dry lips. He has 67 people on the property, and the land itself. The bank loan. Does it include the people as chattel? It does, Eli confirmed grimly. It's a blanket note. Land, buildings, and all assets attached. But the value is complicated. Boyd has inflated the value of the land in the documents, hoping the bank wouldn't send a competent appraiser down here until after harvest. If the bank forecloses, they take everything. They sell us off piece by piece to cover the mortgage. This was the core of her terror and her power. If Boyd went down alone, they might be scattered, sold to Georgia, to Mississippi, their lives extinguished like sparks. If the bank or Callahan seized the property now, they would be transferred as a single lot, which increased the chances of them being held together under new ownership, or at least sold regionally. But Mary Lou wasn't aiming for a gentle transition. She was aiming for leverage. Eli, listen close. We don't want the bank to foreclose completely, not yet. We want them to feel the pressure from Callahan. Callahan is a merchant. He only cares about cash flow, not land management. And what do you propose? We need to send those papers, or copies of the most damaging parts, to Callahan, but not directly. We need him to know that Boyd Finch has been systematically undervaluing his existing crop, concealing a secondary shipment of goods, and most importantly, we need Callahan to know that Boyd is planning to default on the bank loan before he pays Callahan back. That'll make Callahan furious, Eli observed. Furious enough to act immediately. Callahan will panic and push the bank to freeze Boyd's assets before the foreclosure date. That chaos is the window we need. The strategy was risky, relying on the predictable greed and mutual distrust of white men. How do we get this information to Charleston, Mary Lou? We can't walk it, and every letter sent from the plantation is opened by the overseer. This was where Mary Lou's true craft came into play. Not stitching, but encoding. The quilts, she murmured. The new shipment of cotton batting and fine silk thread arrived last week. Boyd wants those fancy commemorative throws finished before his brother's visit next month. They are going to Charleston to be finished with the imported lace trim and then sent back. Eli understood immediately. Quilt patterns had long been a secret language among the enslaved, a visual code of resistance, direction, and warning. But Mary Lou's language was more precise. The accounting details, the hidden notes, Callahan's name, they will all be in the stitching, she explained. Not in the pattern, Eli, that's too crude. In the tension of the thread, in the number of knots hidden beneath the fabric, the distance between the stitches. I can encode pages of information in a single 9-block square. Only someone looking for financial figures would recognize it. A clerk, maybe. Someone counting inventory. The risk was immense. The quilt was a physical document of conspiracy. If the intended recipient, Callahan's accountant, a man rumored to be as ruthless as his boss, missed the coded message, the beautiful throw would simply be admired and returned to the plantation. If he understood, the game began. They spent the next 4 nights meeting in the smokehouse. Eli meticulously copied the most damaging figures and dates onto small scraps of thin paper, which Mary Lou then compared against her encoded stitching plan. She worked with astonishing speed and precision in her cabin during the day, her movements in front of the other women smooth and natural, her focus absolute. She was making a commemorative pattern, a field of stylized cotton blossoms, white on blue. The cotton blossoms represented wealth, the blue the debt, the depth of the ocean of trouble Boyd was drowning in. She hid the true message in the leaves, a complicated, nearly invisible series of French knots and short, tight running stitches that replicated the essential figures, the hidden secondary accounts, the due date of the main mortgage, the specific amount Boyd had been skimming from Callahan's funds. The tension in the quarters became palpable as the deadline approached. Boyd, unaware his financial doom was being physically sewn into a piece of fabric, grew increasingly irritable and erratic. He started selling. First it was the prize hunting dogs, then the expensive brandy cellar, finally the people. Macy and her 2 boys are gone, Eli informed Mary Lou one damp morning, his face etched with strain. Macy was a washerwoman, a quiet, gentle soul. To where? Mary Lou asked, her needle freezing above the fabric. Columbia. They left before sunup. Boyd told the overseer it was reducing overhead. He's desperate to show a healthy cash reserve before the 6-week mark hits. Mary Lou felt the loss, the violent tear in their small community, but she folded it immediately into the calculation. Macy's sale proved two things. Boyd was hemorrhaging cash, and he was moving his assets in secret. This fueled her rage, and that rage became the clarity of her work. She tightened the stitches, weaving the names of the sold individuals into the very edge of the quilt, a border of silent witness. If this plan worked, the loss of Macy and her children would be the last. Finally, the quilt was ready. It was beautiful, rich, and deadly. The opportunity for transport came on a Tuesday. Tobias, the elderly wagon driver, was taking the first full shipment of tobacco and a load of dry goods into Charleston, a 3-day round trip. Mary Lou cornered Tobias by the watering troughs before dawn. She pressed a small dried piece of jerky into his hand, a rare luxury. "Tobias," she said, her voice low and direct, "I need this package delivered. It goes to the delivery docks, to the man who handles the goods for Callahan and Sons, the one with the mole on his cheek." Tobias's eyes, roomy with age and fatigue, narrowed. "Mary Lou, you know I can't be carrying no messages. Boyd would have my hide." "It's not a message, Tobias. It's the finished embroidery for the master's wife, but you must hand it only to that one specific man. Tell him it's essential for the governor's wife's pleasure." This was a lie Boyd had used before to ensure quick handling. "And Tobias, if anyone else tries to take it, or if it is opened before it reaches that man, Boyd will know you were careless. You'll be finished with the wagons." Tobias stared at the beautifully folded linen square wrapped around the embroidery frame. The threat of losing his wagon route, his only reprieve from the field, was enough. He nodded once, tucking the package carefully beneath the heavy tobacco bales. "Don't worry, child. It'll get there." And then Mary Lou could do nothing but wait. The next 10 days stretched out like a slow, deliberate torture. The anxiety was a physical weight, pressing down on the entire plantation. Every day that passed brought them closer to the 6-week deadline. Boyd was drinking more heavily, staying out late, often riding to town himself instead of sending Eli. He was trying to negotiate more credit, perhaps finding a temporary fix. Mary Lou tracked the days by the position of the sun and the length of the shadows in the kitchen. She ate little, slept less, focusing all her energy on maintaining her facade of quiet domesticity. She polished the silver, cooked the meals, and listened. Listening was her second great skill. On the 11th day, a flurry of activity erupted at the manor house. A fast carriage, not the usual lumbering farm wagon, arrived mid-morning. It bore the insignia of Callahan and Sons. Mary Lou, serving morning tea, saw the two men who emerged. The sharp-eyed accountant, Mr. Thompson, and a thick-necked, severe-looking man she recognized as Callahan's chief enforcer. They did not wait for an appointment. They strode directly into the study. Boyd Finch, who had been lazily scanning the morning paper, dropped it immediately. "Gentlemen, what a surprise." Boyd's voice was too loud, too jovial, the sound of a man trying to mask fear with volume. The accountant, Thompson, carried a severe official-looking document. "Mr. Finch, we received certain disturbing information regarding your current and projected assets." Mary Lou poured the tea in the adjacent dining room, ensuring the door was slightly ajar. She didn't have to strain to hear. "Disturbing, I assure you my assets are entirely in order. The crop is coming along beautifully. We expect a major yield. I told you this, Thompson." "You told us you expected a major yield, yes." Thompson's voice was dry, cutting. "But you failed to mention the existing writ of attachment placed against your stored inventory by the People's Bank for default contingency due to the impending 6-week deadline on the principal mortgage." Mary Lou felt a tremor of satisfaction. The information from the quilt had worked. Thompson knew about the bank. He knew Boyd was planning to let Callahan take the hit while securing the bank's collateral. "That is preposterous," Boyd bellowed. "Lies, slander." "We have the numbers, Finch," Thompson countered, his voice rising in impatience. "We also have information that you are concealing a secondary shipment of sugar and tobacco intended for private sale in Wilmington, diverting funds that should have secured your account with us. Furthermore, your valuation of the land is grossly inflated relative to the projected interest accrual." "Who told you this?" Boyd demanded, desperation tightening his voice. "This is privileged information. Where did you get these figures?" Thompson paused, letting the silence hang heavy. "That is irrelevant. What is relevant, Mr. Finch, is that we cannot afford to wait 6 weeks for the bank to take precedent. We are now invoking the clause for immediate repayment of $15,000, or we seize all non-chattel assets immediately, including the crop, the remaining mules, and the manor furniture. Effective immediately." The chief enforcer stepped forward, placing a hand heavily on the polished mahogany desk. The message was clear. Negotiation was over. Mary Lou knew Boyd Finch's mind. He saw his wealth evaporating, his land, his status, his reputation, all dissolving into debt. He was a cornered animal, and cornered animals were the most dangerous. Boyd suddenly shifted tactics, his voice softening into a dangerous growl. "Thompson, surely we can make a deal. I can give you 5 field hands now. Good workers, prime age. That should satisfy the debt for now, yes? We can call it 20,000 in assets." Mary Lou's hand tightened on the silver teapot. He was offering their lives as collateral, tossing them away like loose change to save his dignity. Thompson remained unmoved. "We are merchants, Mr. Finch. We deal in liquid capital, not field labor. We need cash flow now, and frankly, your desperation to sell off your human assets only confirms your true financial insolvency." The insult was profound. Thompson was essentially calling Boyd a poor businessman. The meeting ended abruptly, the 2 men from Charleston leaving as quickly as they arrived, leaving behind a devastated, raging master. Mary Lou quickly cleared the tea things, her face expressionless. She heard Boyd thrashing about in his study, breaking objects. That night, the reaction was swift and terrifying. Boyd sent word through the overseer that everyone would work from sunup to sundown without rest or meal breaks until the remaining tobacco was cured and ready for immediate shipment to a buyer he hoped to secure upstate. The community was exhausted and terrified. The threat of sale had passed, replaced by the crushing weight of impossible labor, but Mary Lou understood the deeper meaning. Boyd Finch was panicking. He was trying to generate cash fast enough to stave off both the bank and Callahan, hoping a last-minute sale would let him buy time. He would fail. The math of the notes she had seen was irreversible. The complication was now fully engaged. The outside world was putting pressure on Boyd, but that pressure was directly translated into suffering for the people on the plantation. Mary Lou had achieved chaos, but chaos needed to be carefully managed. She met Eli again 2 nights later by the river, the air thick with damp moss. "They're going to work us to death before the bank arrives," Eli whispered, looking haggard. "We lost Jonas today. Heat exhaustion. Boyd didn't even stop the line." "I know," Mary Lou said, her voice strained. "We have to accelerate the timeline. 6 weeks is too long. If we can trigger the final action in the next 2, we save lives." "What final action?" Mary Lou reached into her apron pocket and pulled out another piece of paper. Not a Finch document, but a small, carefully drawn map. It was the layout of the manor house and the surrounding slave quarters, detailed down to the position of the heavy iron safe in the study. Callahan put the pressure on the man's pride. "Now we put the pressure on his life," Mary Lou stated, her eyes dark and steady in the moonlight. "Boyd Finch is now a thief in his own mind. He won't trust the bank and he won't trust Callahan. He'll secure whatever cash he has left and prepare to run." "You think he'll run?" "I know it. He's a coward first, a businessman second. When he realizes he can't pay both debts, he'll try to save himself. We need to be ready when he makes that move." Her plan, already audacious, now required an act of physical intrusion and synchronized timing that bordered on the impossible. She had to enter the study again, not just to observe, but to act. "He keeps the key to the main safe in a lockbox, hidden behind the paneling in his bedroom," she detailed, pointing to a spot on the crude map. "I need to access that key, open the safe, and replace any remaining cash with something else. Then we wait for the morning of the bank's deadline." "Mary Lou, that's suicide," Eli breathed. "He sleeps with a pistol under his pillow now. He's paranoid." "Paranoid, yes, but predictable," she countered. "He takes the laudanum when his conscience bothers him, or when he's had too much whiskey. That gives me a window of maybe 30 minutes. Enough time to open the safe, take the cash, and leave the evidence we need to ensure the bank takes over, cleanly and quickly." "Evidence?" Mary Lou gave him a look that chilled him more than the swamp air. "Boyd Finch will not leave this world with his dignity or his debt intact. The money is to ensure we have means for the next phase. The evidence is to ensure his ruin is total, personal, and permanent. She had prepared a final message for the bank, a concise, damning note detailing Boyd's specific plan to flee north with the liquid capital, leaving the bank holding nothing but mortgaged land and people he had devalued. This note needed to be placed inside the safe, to be found after the inevitable search. They refined the plan for the next few days, focusing on the timing of the laudanum. Boyd had a recurring pain in his leg, an old war wound he constantly complained about. Mary Lou, as the house servant, had access to the remedies. On the third night of their refined planning, Boyd returned from a desperate, failed meeting in town. He was drunk, defeated, and shouting curses at the empty halls. Mary Lou was preparing his hot toddy. "More laudanum, Maria," he slurred, using her former name, a sign of his deep intoxication. "My leg is throbbing like the devil himself is pulling at the joint." She looked at the small vial of dark liquid in her hand. This was not a test run. This was the moment. The complication phase was over. The climax was beginning. She measured the usual dose of laudanum into the toddy, and then, slowly, deliberately, she added an extra measure, enough to ensure a profound, irreversible slumber for the next 5 hours. It was a fine line between sedation and complete paralysis, but Mary Lou knew the man's tolerance better than he knew his own face. She carried the toddy into the study. Boyd drank it greedily, complaining about the taste but savoring the heat. "Get out," he mumbled, waving her away, already slumping into his chair. Mary Lou retreated. She waited 10 agonizing minutes in the kitchen, listening. The shouting stopped. The air settled into a thick silence, heavier than the night before. She heard the sound she was waiting for, the dull, heavy thud of a man collapsing from his chair onto the rug. Not loud enough to wake the household, but conclusive. The path to the bedroom was open. The clock was running. Mary Lou, the silent weaver, the calculating cook, finally moved toward the final desperate act of the night, knowing that if she failed, not only her life, but the lives of 67 people would be forfeited to the cruel mathematics of the market. She was the only thing standing between them and the auction block. She was no longer just preparing a defense. She was launching the final assault. Mary Lou moved through the house, a ghost of her former fearful self. She reached the master bedroom door, paused, and slowly pushed it open, stepping into the darkness. The air was heavy with stale brandy and the sickeningly sweet scent of laudanum. The climax was now. She had 2 hours maximum before the sedative wore off enough to trigger some kind of movement. Her focus was fixed on the paneling beside the heavy mahogany armoire. She had memorized the exact angle, the precise pressure needed to dislodge the hidden lockbox containing the safe key. She was reaching, her fingers finding the small, almost invisible notch, when she heard the floorboard above her squeak. The snoring had stopped. Mary Lou froze, the Finch papers clutched in her hand. The silence was absolute now, the heavy, dangerous kind that preceded violence. She knew that sound. It wasn't the sound of Boyd rolling over. It was the sound of weight being settled onto the soles of bare feet. He was awake. He was listening. End of chapter 2. Approx. 2,150 words. The scent of pipe tobacco and stale brandy hung heavy in the air, a thick blanket woven over the sharp tang of old paper. Mary Lou did not breathe, not a single visible intake. Her body was a rigid, exquisite wire. Boyd was not above her anymore. He was beside her, separated by only the thin planking of the ceiling and the half-century of accumulated dust in the walls. She heard the soft, almost liquid thump as his feet finally left the floorboards and padded softly on the rug. He was moving, not toward the door to the hall, but toward the desk, toward the safe. He hadn't heard the specific click of the safe mechanism. He'd heard the slight shift of weight, the settling of the foundation timbers beneath the parlor floor, amplified by the dead quiet of the hour. Boyd was a light sleeper, prone to nightmares induced by whiskey and bad investments. He was also a paranoid man who had spent a lifetime accumulating enemies and debt. He kept a loaded pistol in the top drawer. Mary Lou slipped the Finch papers into the deep hidden pocket sewn into the lining of her work skirt, a pocket designed not for documents, but for pilfered sugar and tiny bits of thread. It was snug, safe, and silent. She used the next 3 heartbeats to locate her immediate escape route. Not the back door, too loud. The window, perhaps. But the window led straight into the meticulously maintained rose garden, and Boyd might be looking out. She retreated backwards, a slow, agonizing crawl on her belly across the cold marble floor. The heavy shadow of the mahogany desk loomed before her, offering a brief pool of absolute darkness. She paused there, listening to the tiny snick as Boyd pulled the desk drawer open upstairs. He was fumbling for the pistol. He thought someone had breached the main house. Good. Let him think that. She reached the service hallway leading to the kitchen, a long, narrow tunnel of polished pine. She risked a single, silent pull of air into her lungs, the air tasting of yeast and mildew. She rose to her feet, moving now at the speed of a striking viper, not making a sound that wasn't already background noise. She slid through the pantry door, bolted it silently from the inside and sank onto the floor, the cold wood pressing comfortingly against her temple. She waited. Upstairs, the heavy sound of a chair scraping back indicated Boyd was now fully dressed and moving with purpose. He was hunting. He would search the common rooms, look for a broken window, a missing silver spoon. He would never think of the root cellar, not in the middle of the night, not unless he suspected her. Mary Lou stayed in the pantry until the first faint rooster crows cut through the false dawn. The Finch papers were hot against her hip, not with heat, but with the cold weight of absolute consequence. She hadn't just stolen a document, she had stolen the future of the Finch plantation, and by extension Boyd's last chance at solvency. The plan, previously a distant strategic exercise, was now scheduled for the next 11 hours. There was no going back, no second guess. She had the key to their destruction hidden in her pocket, and she had the means of execution waiting in the kitchen garden. The day of the Grand Southern Ball dawned bright and mercilessly hot, a humid shroud clinging to Charleston. The Finch plantation house was a frenzy of activity, a manic rush of spit and polish, usually reserved for the arrival of the president himself. Carriages were already arriving hours before sunset, bringing hired help, free black men and women mostly, to supplement the enslaved kitchen staff. The air buzzed with the frantic, brittle energy of the elite preparing to put on airs. Mary Lou was a ghost in the epicenter of the chaos. She moved between the blazing hot ovens and the overflowing ice chests, her face expressionless, her instructions clipped and precise. She was organizing the entire banquet, the spiced hams, the dozens of chickens, the mountains of cornbread, and most importantly, the drinks. Boyd had been frantic all morning, his face pale and haggard. He'd found nothing out of place, no sign of intrusion, but the knowledge that something was wrong gnawed at him. He'd even questioned her, his voice low and accusatory, about the strange smell of tobacco smoke lingering by the west window. "Smelled nothing, Master Boyd," she had replied, stirring the immense copper cauldron of punch base. "Too much sugar in the air to smell anything but sweetness, praise be." He had stared at her hands, which never trembled, and then dismissed her with a wave of annoyance, muttering about phantom thieves and too much late-night brandy. He was too preoccupied with the impending sale to focus on a shadow in the night. The punch was the centerpiece, the celebratory drink that would baptize the merger of the Finches and the Boyds. It was a traditional recipe, rich with dark rum, citrus, and spices, served from a sterling silver cistern that had been in the Finch family since the Revolution. Mary Lou knew that the real artistry of slow, systemic destruction lay not in the violence but in the delivery. It needed to be invisible, unavoidable, and entirely attributable to bad luck or spoiled food. She had cultivated the garden for this moment. Beneath the high cotton veneer of the plantation, Mary Lou had spent years learning not only the uses of local herbs, but the slow, silent wisdom of the poisons. There was a difference between a quick death and an effective one. The quick death brought immediate justice but certain reprisal. The slow one brought chaos, confusion, and the kind of debilitating sickness that tore at the very fabric of social order. She stepped out momentarily, ostensibly to check the herbs for garnish. The heat outside was staggering, a living presence. She knelt by the shaded patch behind the smokehouse where the cicuta maculata grew tall and green, water hemlock, one of the most toxic plants in North America. She didn't need the roots. The seeds and leaves were enough for her purpose. She crushed a small handful in a mortar she kept hidden beneath a loose stone, reducing the matter to a fine, almost tasteless powder. Back inside, amid the clatter of silverware and the shouted orders of the hired caterer, Mary Lou worked at the punch table. "This needs a little something extra, Mary Lou," the caterer, a large, bustling white woman named Mrs. Dubois, decreed, wiping sweat from her brow. "Make it sing. Boyd is paying top dollar for this lot. Let's make it memorable." "Yes, ma'am," Mary Lou murmured. She picked up a delicate silver strainer, ostensibly to remove excess zest from the citrus infusion. Her hands, moving with the cold precision she had honed over decades of servitude, introduced the powder. It dissolved instantly, undetectable against the complex blend of spices, rum, and sugar. She stirred it with a long silver ladle, her eyes fixed on the reflective surface of the punch bowl. It looked like celebration. It tasted like wealth. It was death. The ballroom, vast and cavernous, was suffocatingly hot but brilliant with candlelight. The air was thick with perfume, sweat, and the booming laughter of men who believed they owned the earth beneath their feet. Boyd Finch, resplendent in a heavy black coat that seemed inappropriate for the climate, was holding court near the fireplace, sipping his first glass of the infamous punch. He was beaming, basking in the glow of the imminent financial security the merger provided. He had, Mary Lou noticed, completely forgotten his restless night. The documents, safe in his office, and the promise of land cleared all shadows from his mind. Mary Lou was assigned to the service line, ensuring the glasses were never empty. This was her role, the invisible conduit of pleasure and satiety. Tonight, she was the conduit of something else entirely. She watched the governor, his wife, the local judge, the sheriff, and all the key players in the county's infrastructure, the pillars of the system that held her in chains, partake. They were drinking quickly, enthusiastically, celebrating their future prosperity, blind to the slow creeping paralysis settling into their systems. The effects were not immediate, as intended. The cicuta maculata needed time to work through the complex chemistry of the body, especially when diluted by alcohol and rich food. An hour into the feast, the first sign of trouble appeared. Judge Hawthorne, a man known for his booming voice and cruel disposition, suddenly clutched his side. He laughed it off, assuming it was the rich food. "Too much ham, I reckon," he roared, draining his glass. Mary Lou refilled it instantly. Her hand was steady. A few minutes later, Mrs. Finch, Boyd's elderly mother, began to cough violently, gripping the edge of the dining table until her knuckles turned white. Her face, usually powdered white with dignity, was flushing crimson. A hired hand rushed forward with a glass of water. The atmosphere shifted from celebratory to merely uneasy. The music continued, but the laughter became brittle, strained. Boyd Finch, however, seemed entirely unaffected. He was entirely too energized, too focused on the conversation with the governor regarding the land deeds. The climax arrived just as the main toast was being given. The governor raised his glass high, thanking Boyd for his foresight and promising a new era of prosperity built on the backs of their human property. Before the governor could finish the toast, Judge Hawthorne seized up completely, dropping his crystal glass, which shattered loudly on the polished floor. He let out a strange, choked sound, a low, guttural moan, and collapsed face first onto the table amidst the untouched fruit and porcelain. For a moment, the entire ballroom went silent. The musicians stopped mid-note. Then, pandemonium. A wave of sickness swept through the attendees almost simultaneously. People clutched their stomachs, crying out in pain and confusion. The illness was sudden, violent and widespread, focused almost exclusively on those who had partaken deeply of the celebratory punch. Those who had stuck to wine or beer seemed merely confused, startled by the sudden terror. The enslaved staff, including Mary Lou and the other field hands brought in for service, reacted exactly as they had been trained, with silent, wide-eyed terror and deference. They rushed to assist, clearing the shattered glass, helping the collapsing bodies. But there was a strange, terrible stillness in the eyes of the permanent staff, a knowing gravity. They were witnessing the harvest of silent resistance. Boyd Finch was still standing miraculously near the governor, who was now leaning heavily on a servant, his complexion graying rapidly. "What in God's name is this, Boyd?" the governor stammered, his voice raw. "Food poisoning?" Boyd's face was a mask of sheer paralyzing horror. It wasn't the sickness itself that terrified him. It was the realization of the immediate consequences. If the governor, the judge, and the rest of the key investors died tonight, the contract signing scheduled for the morning would be irrelevant. The leverage was gone. The land deal, the only thing standing between him and financial ruin, had dissolved into this toxic chaos. "The punch!" someone screamed, pointing a shaky finger at the silver cistern. It was the punch. The focus shifted immediately to the kitchen staff, to the invisible hands that had prepared the feast. Boyd, finally shaken out of his stupor, turned the full force of his desperate, cornered anger toward Mary Lou. She was standing at the edge of the service door, a clean white apron tied around her waist, holding a tray with an empty glass. She looked to the casual observer like a perfect picture of subservient efficiency. "Mary Lou," Boyd roared, pushing a convulsing woman aside. "What did you put in that punch?" His voice cracked with desperation. He didn't ask if she did it. He asked, what? It was an implicit accusation born of years of subconscious fear, the fear that the invisible people were always watching, always calculating. Mary Lou slowly lowered the empty tray. Her eyes, usually dark and downcast, were lifted and fixed on him. They held a cold, unwavering light, utterly devoid of the fear he depended on. "Sugar, Master Boyd," she said, her voice soft but carrying perfectly across the gasping, groaning room. "Just sugar and rum, sir, just as you asked." But the way she said it, the slight, almost imperceptible emphasis on the just, made the lie ring with the terrible sound of the truth. It was a refusal to panic, a refusal to submit even in the moment of confrontation. Boyd recognized that look. He had seen it once before, years ago, in the eyes of a field hand who was about to be hanged for striking an overseer. It was the look of a person who had already accepted their fate and was therefore free of all earthly ties. He lunged for her, abandoning all decorum, all pretense of hospitality. "You treacherous bitch!" he shrieked, his voice thin with terror. But Mary Lou was already gone. She didn't run towards the back door or the fields. That was what he expected. She ran down the service hall, ducking past the panicked hired waiters who were now stumbling over themselves trying to escape the house of horrors. She ran straight to Boyd's private study, the same room she had infiltrated hours before. The study was locked, but Mary Lou knew the lock was old and susceptible to a simple wire pick, a skill she had learned from a traveling smith 15 years prior. She knelt quickly, her fingers trained for delicate embroidery, working with lightning speed. Click. The door opened. She raced to the safe. Boyd's paranoia worked against him. He hadn't changed the combination in a decade, fearful that changing it might make him forget it. The numbers were not complex, they were sentimental. The birth year of his first and only surviving daughter, long since married and gone. Mary Lou spun the dial, 1834. The heavy steel door swung open silently. The safe was packed with cash, deeds, and personal correspondence. She didn't touch the money. She reached past the currency to the bottom partition, where the legal documents regarding the Finch property transfer were stacked. Dozens of pages, signed and ready for the morning's transaction. She pulled out the stack of documents, along with a bottle of very expensive, very old port wine that Boyd kept locked away. From the ballroom, she could hear the horrifying sound of retching and the frantic shouts of the few men still standing, trying to bring order to the chaos. The house was now a madhouse of suffering. Mary Lou grabbed a heavy antique silver inkwell from the desk, poured the contents, thick black liquid, onto the documents, and began to shred them with focused, cold fury. She tore the papers into small, illegible strips, mixing them thoroughly with the ink, and then pouring the thick ruby port wine over the whole mess. She mashed the paper pulp with the heel of her boot, ensuring that no single word of the contract could ever be reconstituted. The Finch future was now nothing more than a sticky, purple sludge on the floor of Boyd's study. She took a moment, leaning against the cold, safe door, to savor the profound, deep quiet of the study, a silence so utterly unlike the terrified pandemonium 20 yards away. She had destroyed the evidence of her crime, the contract, and she had the evidence of the Finch land deal documents, pressed against her hip. The symmetry of the moment was complete. A pounding came from the main hallway, the sound of heavy bodies running down the stairs. Boyd had realized she wasn't running for the woods. He realized she was completing the destruction. Mary Lou opened the tall window overlooking the rose garden. The window was too small for Boyd's frame, but it was perfect for hers. She vaulted lightly onto the sill. The garden below was dark, shadowed by the enormous oaks. It was a 40-foot drop, but there was a sturdy trellis covered in climbing wisteria right next to the window. She heard Boyd crash against the study door behind her, throwing his shoulder into the lock. She didn't hesitate. She released her grip on the sill and dropped, catching the wisteria vine just as the old lock gave way with a splintering groan. Boyd burst into the room. He saw the ruined documents on the floor, the open safe, the empty window. He saw the destruction of his life's work. Mary Lou was already scrambling down the trellis, the vines scratching at her hands, the rough brick scraping her apron. She was almost at the ground when Boyd appeared in the window opening, his face distorted, half mad with rage and the incipient dread of financial and social ruin. He screamed her name, not Mary Lou, but her full birth name, the name he had forbidden her to use. "Adira, you will hang for this, you hear me? You will hang." Mary Lou hit the soft earth of the rose garden. She didn't look back. The papers pressed against her side, the true Finch papers, the ones detailing the illegal collateral and the hidden debts. These were her insurance. She ran towards the edge of the property, not stopping for breath, not acknowledging the pain in her scraped hands. She passed the slave quarters, where the entire population of the Finch property was awake, standing in absolute silence, watching the terrible, beautiful light show coming from the main house. She saw their faces, a mixture of fear, bewilderment, and a dawning, terrible awe. They didn't move to stop her. They didn't move to help her. They just watched her run, a single dark shape fleeing the inferno she had ignited. Mary Lou reached the low stone wall bordering the woods. She paused for a single breath, tasting the night air that for the first time in 30 years did not feel like a cage. From the house, a pistol shot rang out, followed by a series of desperate shouts. Boyd was shooting into the darkness, blindly, recklessly. Mary Lou crossed the wall and plunged into the dense, silent protection of the woods, the sound of the desperate white man's rage fading behind her. She knew they would hunt her relentlessly. The destruction she had caused was too great, too public, too effective to be ignored. The death count would be high, and the disruption to Charleston's elite was catastrophic. She also knew that the documents she carried, the proof of the Finch family's crimes, were the only things that could guarantee her survival, or at least the survival of her purpose. But the woods were not the end. The woods were merely the beginning of the road to the north, and she was utterly, completely alone. The scent of hemlock and burning hatred clung to the night air. The woods were not a sanctuary. They were a cruel, indifferent passage. For 3 nights, Clara moved by the weak, shifting light of the moon, guided only by the frantic knowledge that every yard covered was a yard removed from the immediate, catastrophic consequences of her actions. Her left shoulder throbbed, where a falling beam had struck her during the collapse of the West Wing, but the pain was a dull, constant roar, easily ignored when set against the sharper, more immediate threat of pursuit. She survived on the few scraps she'd managed to grab, a piece of dried cornbread and a canteen near empty. The documents, wrapped tightly in oilskin and tied to her waist beneath her thin cloak, felt less like paper and more like a heavy stone. They were the evidence, the price, the burden. Clara had always known the wilderness around Finchland, but knowing it and surviving it were 2 different reckonings. The swamps to the east were impassable now. She had to track northwest, aiming for the high, dry ridges that fed into the Piedmont. She moved only during the hours between midnight and dawn, resting in the deepest, most tangled thickets during the day, where the humid air hung heavy and insects buzzed their endless, tormenting chorus. Fear was a constant companion, but it had curdled into a cold, hard substance in her belly. It wasn't the paralyzing fear of a slave. It was the focused dread of a strategist who understood the consequences of failure. On the 4th morning, tucked beneath the roots of an ancient sycamore, she heard the hounds, not distant baying, but the sharp, close cries that meant they were following a fresh, certain scent. They were faster than she had anticipated, and they knew the terrain. Finch would spare no expense, use every man he owned to capture her, and more importantly, recover whatever she had taken. The implication of the documents, the full ledger of stolen identities, the falsified mortgages, the complex web of usury that propped up the Finch empire, was more dangerous to him than the loss of the estate itself. Clara pushed herself up, ignoring the protest of her muscles. She had to break the scent trail. She scrambled down the ravine, finding the small, cold stream she had identified the night before. Wading upstream for nearly a mile, the freezing water numbing her feet, she placed each step carefully on the mossy stones, trying not to stir the sediment. When she finally stumbled out onto a dry bank, shivering violently, the sound of the dogs was faint, confusing. They were struggling, sniffing the air, uncertain where their quarry had vanished. She had gained a few precious hours. That evening, just as the last sliver of the sun bled away, she saw the marker. It wasn't a conventional sign, nothing a casual traveler would notice. A specific knot tied in a branch of a white oak, pointing north, paired with 3 stones stacked unevenly beneath it. This was the signal she had learned about years prior, from a weary, taciturn man who passed through Finchland carrying axes for sale, a man whose eyes held a map of secret paths. She followed the path indicated by the sign until she reached a small hardscrabble farm built low in a valley, its chimney smoking faintly against the deepening twilight. The farm looked poor, ordinary, the kind of place no one would think to search. Clara approached the back door, her heart hammering against her ribs like a captive bird. She knocked 4 times, a slow, deliberate rhythm, then waited. The door opened just a crack, revealing a man's face framed by a thick, graying beard and wary eyes. He carried a heavy-gauge shotgun loosely in his hand. "Evening, ma'am," the man said, his voice a low, steady rumble, devoid of question or surprise. Clara swallowed, finding her voice raspy from disuse and terror. She used the coded phrase the Axeman had given her, the one that proved she was not an informer, nor a spy, but a traveler in desperate need. "I am seeking the river that runs to freedom. My vessel is broken, and I carry a heavy cargo." The man's eyes flickered down to the bulge at her waist. He didn't smile, but the tension in his face eased microscopically. He stepped back and gestured her inside, closing the door softly but firmly behind her. "Come in, sister. This is the place where the vessel is repaired. My name is Thomas." The farmhouse kitchen was warm, smelling of wood smoke and old coffee. It was the first true shelter Clara had known in days. Thomas was a farmer, a quiet abolitionist, part of the extensive, dangerous network that spanned the borders. He gave her a bowl of stew, simple, nourishing, and instantly overwhelming. She ate slowly, savoring the feeling of not having to look over her shoulder. Thomas was interested in 2 things, her safety and the cargo. "They are tracking me close," Clara said, pushing the empty bowl away. "I need to move faster than one soul can manage. We will rest you tomorrow, send you on the night after," Thomas replied, cleaning his rifle methodlessly. "But first, we talk about the weight you carry. Is it worth the risk you took?" Clara carefully untied the oilskin bundle. The contents were damp but legible. The Finch ledgers, detailed lists of transactions, human beings catalogued like sacks of grain, and most crucially, the original land deeds and promissory notes detailing the illegal transfers Master Finch had engineered over 2 decades to acquire neighboring properties and leverage the wealth of his partners. She spread the papers out on the scarred wooden table. Thomas leaned close, examining the fine script and the careful mathematical calculations. He was literate, an educated man hidden beneath the guise of a rustic farmer. "This is not just proof of cruelty, sister," Thomas muttered, his finger tracing a column of numbers. "This is proof of fraud, tax evasion, racketeering. This is enough to ruin him body and soul." "That is my intent," Clara said, her voice steady. "I need these documents to get into the hands of someone who can use them, someone who can tear his foundations out from under him, not just take his life." She remembered the smoke rising over Finchland, the satisfied ruin. But Finch himself was still out there, chasing her, fueled by rage and desperation. A man stripped of his material wealth was a far more miserable creature than a dead man. Thomas nodded slowly. "There is a network that handles paper, Clara. Lawyers, journalists, men who believe that the true war is fought in the courthouse, not on the battlefield. They have stations set up in Philadelphia. They will know how to prosecute this." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, recognizing the cost of the sacrifice. "But you, my sister, once these papers are public, there is no place in the South, and perhaps nowhere in this country, where you will be safe if they know who brought the ruin." "I am not seeking safety," Clara stated, her eyes locking onto his. "I am seeking resolution. I know the cost of the documents, but I also know the value of them." She spent the next 24 hours in the farmhouse, resting, washing the grime and the scent of ash from her skin. Thomas had her memorize the next set of signals and the names of the next 2 contacts. She ate well, hoarding the strength she would need for the long, agonizing trek ahead. On the second night, under a sky thick with stars, Thomas loaded her into a small wagon hidden beneath bales of hay and drove her 10 miles to the north, transferring her to the care of a Quaker woman in a town closer to the border. The journey was a blur of hiding places, dark basements, dusty attics, the cramped space beneath false floorboards. Each step north was a triumph of endurance over fear. She used her meticulous sense of calculation and observation, skills honed over years of servitude, to anticipate trouble, to read the mood of the towns they passed, to distinguish genuine allies from those who were merely suspicious or hostile. 3 weeks after leaving the burning ruins of Finchland, Clara crossed the Pennsylvania line. She did not weep. She did not raise her hands to the sky in celebration. She simply stood on free soil, felt the cold mud beneath her worn boots, and allowed herself one deep, steady breath of air that did not smell of ownership. The relief was immediate, yet strangely hollow. Freedom, she realized, was not an abstract concept of joy. It was merely the absence of chains, the prerequisite for the real work. She arrived in Philadelphia in late December 1858, a ghost in a strange city. Thomas's contacts had arranged for her to meet with a group of abolitionist lawyers and radical journalists. These men, clad in dark, heavy woolen coats and possessing an air of quiet, grim purpose, received the oilskin documents with reverence. The documents were a goldmine. Finch, blinded by his own greed and sense of untouchable power, had kept meticulously detailed records, believing his own penmanship to be inviolable proof of his status. The ledgers, combined with Clara's testimony, provided in detail but kept carefully anonymous, exposed not only the illegal acquisition of land, but also a vast, systematic tax fraud scheme that implicated several prominent regional politicians who were Finch's partners. The ensuing legal storm, fueled by articles in the radical northern press, was swift and devastating. The papers loved the story. The wealthy, arrogant southern planter reduced to a common criminal by his own meticulous records. They did not know the documents were delivered by a woman who had been his property. They only knew the truth they revealed. The Finch family name was toxic. Investigations led to asset seizures. The political fallout shivered the timbers of the state legislature. The Finch properties, what remained of them, were tied up in litigation for years. William Finch, unable to cope with the sudden and total collapse of his kingdom, was ruined financially and socially. Rumors eventually reached Philadelphia that he had become a pathetic figure, drinking heavily in cheap taverns, forever cursing the negligent staff who had let the house burn, never quite grasping that the true damage came not from fire, but from the paper she had stolen. Clara, now using the name Esther, vanished into the bustling, anonymous heart of Philadelphia's free black community. She did not seek the spotlight or the praise of the abolitionist leagues. She understood that her continued safety lay in obscurity, and her power lay in quiet contribution. Her mathematical genius, her photographic memory, and her years spent managing the invisible infrastructure of a vast plantation were not skills typically found in a young, recently escaped woman. Esther found work not as a servant, but as a bookkeeper for a small, integrated cooperative that specialized in supplying goods to other free black businesses in the North. Her hands, accustomed to measuring rations and calculating yield, now tallied accounts and tracked inventory. She was precise, efficient, and utterly reliable. Her transformation was subtle but profound. The deep, ingrained servitude was replaced by a quiet, fierce self-possession. Her hands, once prone to tremor, were now steady as she counted money or balanced ledgers. She dressed simply, always in dark, practical colors, her hair neatly bound. She was respected, if not fully known, by her peers. They saw a competent woman, dedicated to the furtherance of the community, but they rarely saw the fire that still smoldered beneath the surface. Esther never spoke of Finchland. The past remained an invisible scar, guiding her future decisions but never defining her present conversation. The few individuals who knew the full truth, Thomas and the lead lawyer, Mr. Harding, respected her silence. One warm spring afternoon in 1862, 4 years after her arrival, Mr. Harding sought her out at the cooperative. He sat opposite her in the small, cramped office, waiting patiently while she finished calculating a shipment of textiles. "Esther," he said finally, resting his hands on her ledger, "the war has been going badly, as you know. But there are changes. General Hunter has begun enlisting colored regiments in South Carolina, and Lincoln is considering the Emancipation Proclamation." Esther only nodded, her expression neutral. She watched the news closely, the shifting tides of the conflict providing the only true hope she had ever known. "The work of the League has shifted," Harding continued. "We need people who can manage complex logistics, supply lines, payroll, tracking the movement of regiments. We need more than enthusiasm, Esther. We need calculation." He paused, letting the weight of the request settle. "We need you to use the skills you once used to manage the resources of a plantation for the sake of the Union effort. It is dangerous, essential work. You will be working with army quartermasters, dealing with immense sums of money." Esther looked down at the ledger she was holding. She saw the lines of numbers, the precise balance of profit and loss. For 20 years, her talent for calculation had been used to build a man's evil empire. Now the skill was hers, redeemed by the use to which she could put it. "Does this involve returning south?" she asked, her voice low. "It might. Administrative centers are being established in occupied territories along the coast." Esther closed the ledger slowly, the sound clicking finality in the small office. She had spent 4 years rebuilding her life, earning her freedom, and securing her anonymity. To step back into the sphere of federal visibility, even under a pseudonym, was to risk everything. Finch, or men like him, still had eyes and ears. But the purpose she carried north was not simply personal vengeance. It was the destruction of the entire system that had birthed William Finch. "I will require a salary," Esther stated, not as a request, but a term of contract. $100 a month, paid into a separate account. "And I must have access to accurate shipping manifests and resource allocation for the colored regiments first." Harding blinked, surprised by the specificity of the demand. Most of the volunteers were working purely from moral conviction. "That can be arranged, though it is unusual." "I am unusual," Esther replied simply, "and I need to know that the resources I manage are reaching the men who need them most, not being siphoned off by inefficient or corrupt officers." It was a contingency plan, another layer of protection. If the Union failed, if the system proved as corrupt as the one she had fled, she would know exactly where the failure lay. Esther joined the effort as a civilian accountant, utilizing her pseudonym and her quiet efficiency to navigate the labyrinthine logistics of war. She worked long hours in cramped, dusty offices in Washington and later in Beaufort, South Carolina, following the Union advance. She was the ghost in the machine, ensuring that the 200 barrels of salt pork ordered were the 200 barrels delivered, that the pay for the colored troops was calculated correctly, and that every penny was accounted for. Her work was unglamorous, often tedious, but profoundly impactful. While abolitionist speakers stirred hearts with rhetoric, Esther ensured the men fighting had shoes on their feet and rations in their bellies. In 1864, while auditing supply transfers near Savannah, she came across a familiar family name on a requisition list. Finch. Not William, who was long disgraced and vanished, but a distant younger cousin, a Confederate quartermaster captured near Atlanta and now being processed for exchange. The coincidence was too sharp to ignore. She pulled the file. The cousin was attempting to use political leverage to accelerate his release, appealing to old family connections in Washington, connections that William Finch had meticulously documented in his ledgers. Esther, without consulting anyone, drafted a confidential memorandum. She utilized her knowledge of the original Finch fraud, cross-referenced with the names on the supply manifests, exposing a clear line of economic treason dating back years. She presented the memo directly to a Union investigator she trusted, ensuring the connection was made quietly, effectively, and without her signature attached. The cousin's appeal was denied. He remained a prisoner until the war's end, stripped of his family influence. It was not a grand act of violence, but a clean, cold act of financial justice. The system that had built the Finch's fortune, the reliance on opaque transactions and assumed privilege, was the very thing Esther used to systematically dismantle their lingering legacy. When the war ended in 1865, Esther left government service quietly. She had accumulated a respectable sum of money, not by theft or exploitation, but through honest, essential work. She used that money to move west, to Chicago, a city expanding rapidly, hungry for talent and less burdened by the rigid caste system of the South. She opened a small bookkeeping and consulting office, catering primarily to the burgeoning population of formerly enslaved people and northern migrants seeking to establish businesses. She charged fair rates, taught her clients the necessary precision of the ledger, and used her sharp intellect to protect them from the predatory banking practices that often followed the war. She became known as the Fixer, a woman who could untangle any financial mess, who possessed a mind like a steel trap, and whose word was granite. Esther was, by all measures, successful. She bought a small house, paid her taxes diligently, and never missed a meeting of the cooperative she helped found. She saw to it that the story of the documents and the fall of the Finches, stripped of her personal identity, attributed only to an anonymous source, was permanently archived in the Abolitionist Library in Philadelphia, a cautionary tale of greed destroying itself. She was physically free, financially secure, and ethically grounded. But the peace she sought was not the gentle calm of contentment. It was the hard-won quiet that comes after a decades-long war. Late in life, in the 1890s, when she was an older woman with silver hair and eyes that still held the sharp, calculated look of a strategist, she received a letter from a distant contact. The letter contained a clipping from a small Virginia newspaper. It was an obituary for William Finch. He had died penniless in a charity home, a forgotten, disgraced figure whose great estate had long since been broken up and sold for lumber. His death merited 3 short lines, mentioning his former prominence only to underscore the depth of his fall. Esther read the clipping twice. She noted the date, the location, and the finality of the words. She felt no triumph, no fierce surge of satisfaction, only a profound, sterile emptiness. Vengeance once achieved was not a feast. It was merely the cessation of hunger. She folded the clipping and placed it not in her meticulous business files, but in a small cedar box that held her most private possessions. Beside it lay a pressed sprig of hemlock, withered and brown, the scent she associated with the night she chose life over ownership. Esther lived another 5 years, a respected pillar of her community. She never married, never had children. Her legacy was not in bloodline, but in the countless small businesses she helped thrive, the land she helped secure for others, the financial stability she helped forge for a generation emerging from bondage. She taught them that freedom was not a gift bestowed by law, but a discipline practiced daily, rooted in knowledge and secured by the unwavering precision of the ledger. She died peacefully in her sleep in 1901, the ledger for the cooperative balanced perfectly on her nightstand. When the lawyer came to settle her affairs, he found a modest estate perfectly managed and a single sealed instruction. The bulk of her assets were to be placed into a permanent scholarship fund for children of color seeking education in mathematics and commerce. In the small cedar box alongside the hemlock, the lawyer found the framed newspaper clipping. He had never heard the name William Finch. He simply noted the strange inclusion and placed the box back in the safe. The world never knew the name Clara, the slave whose worth was calculated in dollars and muscle. They only knew Esther, the accountant, who understood that true value was measured not by what you owned, but by the precision with which you tracked what was taken and the calculation required to take it back. She was not famous, but she was free. And by using the very tools of her oppression, literacy, calculation, and a cold strategic mind, she had ensured that the master's numbers became the final, damning measure of his own ruin. Her freedom was quiet, absolute, and built on the ashes of his impossible empire.